be here, actually. I'm looking forward to this presentation and some nice, intelligent feedback afterwards as well.
Sorry, they may have broken.
Yeah, I noticed that Tim Cook never had this problem yesterday, but you know, I knew I was in the wrong state. Okay, a little bit about UBS to start with. It's our 150-year anniversary this year, and you know, we have a very, very broad business. So we're in pretty much every country in the world that does wealth management. We serve private, institutional, and corporate clients worldwide, as well as retail clients in Switzerland. We are the biggest wealth manager as well in the world. Okay, we're the biggest wealth manager in the world. That makes it quite challenging as well. You know, if you think about what's happening in our industry, I mean, there's a lot of regulatory changes coming from all the different regulators in the countries we do business in, which makes it more and more difficult to say we can talk about anything as a standard, right? So because the regulators don't work as one, they work as you know, individual sets, and sometimes they collaborate and sometimes they don't. We don't always get the opportunity to standardize as much as we'd like to. We have offices in 50-odd countries. The rest of the wealth management branches are actually sales and marketing organizations that work not in country, but usually, you know, from homes or from small, you know, you know, just sales offices. Basically, they don't have much equipment in them, if any at all. And then finally, we're listed on SIX and the New York Stock Exchange. In terms of how are we doing? We're doing much better since the credit crisis. We've done very well around our 2.2 billion adjusted pre-tax profit last year. Pretty reasonable return on equity as well. We're making good progress across all our business divisions. So in our company, you know, we've grown up as 4 completely separate divisions, and you know, the asset management, wealth management, Americas, wealth management, Swiss bank, and investment banking divisions up until 2009 operated completely independent of each other. So when you think about the stacks that we've inherited, all 4 businesses have basically built their own platforms, and by trying to migrate them into a standards-based environment, there are many voices that you have to listen to determine what will or won't work. We've done actually much better in Windows so far than in other parts of the tech landscape. So in terms of the Windows desktop environment and also the Windows Server environment, we've done a pretty good job on standardizing. And as you'll see in this deck, we're working through the same things now for the other server OSs, the implementation of those on pretty much any virtual infrastructure and so on. We're ahead of our plan to reduce risk-weighted assets. So obviously in a world where the revenues are a lot more volatile and also the valuations on assets are a lot more valuable, reducing risk weighting is essentially the way you reduce your balance sheet commitments. And the more you do that, the less impacted you are by volatility. And the final point is that capital, liquidity, and funding remain strong. Everything you're reading about in Europe right now, in Spain and in Italy and Ireland and all the other places, it's all about capital and liquidity at one level or another, whether it's capital and liquidity of the banks or the example yesterday of the Greek electricity company, who was a massive importer of electricity that didn't have the capital and liquidity to actually continue to buy power. So being strong in capital and liquidity is really important and will be a differentiator going through the next 2 to 3 years as far as we're concerned, and continuing to build on that is very important for us. Come on. How about I just say next slide? Okay. So I like trying new things, and you know, I've been involved with both virtualization and cloud for quite a long time. Some of the automated provisioning we just saw. You know, in a prior life, we did a lot of that when it didn't exist as a service anywhere. We just kind of built a lot of that in-house. And I think you have to be prepared to make some mistakes, and you have to be ready to deal with what happens when you make mistakes, when you're building out new environments. And you know, when you think about an environment like any of the companies that I've worked at anyway, they've grown up over a large number of years. You know, there's investments that date back 35, 40 years at UBS. There are at Bank of America. There are at many of the other companies as well. And if you think about trying to solve the problem at the same level of thinking you were at when the problem was created, you won't be able to solve the problem. You have to come up with a different way of solving the problem, and you have to make it a go-forward way of solving the problem, not a go-backward way. And there's a big difference. Trying to retrofit cloud into your environment is very different than figuring out how you adopt cloud for everything that's net new. When you think about companies like ours, if you look at the IT budget, roughly a third of the budget is being spent on change in any given year, and the other two-thirds is being spent on run. And if you can divert nearly all of your change towards your strategic goal, in 3 years' time, you've made a big impact on your overall portfolio in terms of the percentage that you've achieved. I'm not saying you shouldn't do retrofitting. There are definitely reasons why you'd want to do that, and we are certainly doing that. My point really is just if you think about strategically driving adoption, then you need to be thinking about aligning net new spend behind the thing that you say is your strategy. And the old adage, a strategy is only a strategy if you put all your money behind it, is really important. Strategies don't live in PowerPoint, they live in execution, and that's an important thing. Insanity defined doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. Obviously, if you carry on building more and more different things and expect convergence, then you're not going to get that. So when we think about our business strategy, and to the points discussed in the last presentation, you've got to align your technology strategy behind the business strategy. And we have 3 major tenets of our business strategy. Put the clients at the center of everything we do. So when we're making investments, how does it impact our clients? How do we make our clients' life better off the back of that investment? And client in this context could be an internal producer. It could be someone who makes money on a trading desk or as a financial advisor or whatever. Or it could be an end client. So putting the clients at the center of everything we do is very important in everything, including things like deployment of cloud. So in cloud deployment, who is our first client? It's the developers. What do developers want? How do they want it? When do they want it? How do they want to pay for it? These are the kind of questions that you have to answer about any cloud or any client-centric deployment. Industrialization turns out to be key. Again, in the prior presentation, we heard a lot about supply chain. Supply chain is really important. More and more businesses that have been cachet-based businesses where you've been able to afford to run the entire supply chain yourself are changing. And cloud is an example of how external service providers are entering your supply chain. And the point that was made about ensuring that your supply chain partners are secure is extremely important. So when we think about cloud adoption, whether it's private cloud on-prem or public cloud or whatever it is, one of the first questions we have to answer is, are we introducing a new threat vector? And if we are, how are we going to manage it? What's the risk of implementation? And how are we going to deal with that risk? I think it's easy to say no. Sometimes you have to work out what the cost of saying no is as well as saying yes. And I think that for most people, the right approach to take is a very structured implementation that allows you to take the risk on board and keep learning. The more you can cycle this and learn as you go, the better off you are. But then you're back to the point on experimentation, which is sometimes you won't succeed. And instead of stopping, you have to learn the lessons and make sure you incorporate the lessons into how you move forwards. Effectively managing capital and risk is another example of where the industry probably needs to do better at that. You have to learn from your mistakes, and we are putting a lot of energy and effort into how we manage capital and risk. And as I said before, the new regulatory climate that we're living in is requiring us to take a different approach to how we manage capital and risk. And you see that every day in your newspapers, so I don't need to tell you about it. But it's important that inside your company you make that a really key priority for everybody, and that there are actions being taken that are visible to people inside the company around capital management. Now, interestingly, what's the connection between capital management and cloud? Well, in a cloud environment where you're buying almost everything as a service, you're not paying capital out for data centers, which is one of your biggest capital items, hardware, which is another big capital item, storage, which is an ever-increasing and expanding capital item, and so on and so forth. So thinking about capital and how you manage capital and risk more effectively in technology leads you to a conclusion that you want to reduce your fixed costs, which are all capital related, And the question is, how do you go about doing those? So we'll talk a bit about that later. Every year or so, a team of people, including the CIO, go to the Valley, and we basically go there with a view to meeting with all the VCs and all the private equity companies and understanding not what the key hype cycle elements are, but what are the key technologies that are ready for adoption. And we had a look about a year ago. We really haven't changed our point of view since a year ago, although probably the order of implementation has changed. We actually went 3 weeks ago to California, and I'd say the things that were interesting this time, I'll chat to at the end of this slide once I've done the reveal on this. But I think there's a definite change or wind of change around readiness of adoption for some of these technologies. When you think about the financial services industry, there has been a large information arbitrage play in financial services for a long time. So why is an advisory business so important? Well, because advisors have worked in the industry a long time and they know a lot. So the better you can expose what people know as a service and leverage that within your business, the more opportunity you have to monetize that. And you know, this week's hero could be next week's you know, anti-hero, if you like. So you know, with investment strategies in particular, you know, people have to adapt their investment strategies on the fly to the market. And again, the better analytic capability you have out there to do that, the better off you're going to be. What we see happening in this space is the emergence of a new tier of service providers who are built around cloud as an underlying premise and are able to then both implement with a set of big data that's useful, like, you know, all North American households, for example, credit capability on those and all that kind of thing, and also allow you to overlay your own data on top of that so that you can start to put filters and sieves in place to give you insights that you can't get elsewhere. So I see big data as a platform built on cloud to a large extent, and both internally and externally we're seeing that start to happen. Interestingly, most of the implementations of big data we're seeing on cloud are pretty much priced by the terabyte by the month. There's pretty much no other pricing model that I've seen at this point, which implies, again, that data is probably the big story in that rather than cloud. Sustainability. I think, you know, one of my learnings from my prior job to this one is if you ask a question, you get an answer that you weren't expecting. So we had an offsite in my prior job where we asked every single vendor, what are the most power efficient solutions you have for the current routers, switches, storage, you know, servers that we're currently buying? And in almost every case, the vendor said, well, we've got these power supplies and they're 4 or 5% more expensive to buy, but they have a 30% reduced power draw. So one of my learnings from that is you have to ask, and you have to make it part of your procurement cycle to ask that set of questions on a structured basis for pretty much everything that you buy. And when you ask, you get answers that you can make decisions from. And if you don't ask, you get what they give you, and that's not necessarily what you want. So I think it's important to ask questions around sustainability and make sure that you understand what are the most important criteria that you should be judging what to buy from. Consumerization of IT, clearly changing everything. Also a massive enabler for cloud as far as we've found so far. We see the kind of coming together of enterprise and consumer as an opportunity to deliver both old stuff in new ways as well as new stuff in new ways as well. So when it comes to BI and providing visualization capability to people, clearly on the back end of that, you generally have cloud infrastructure that scales up or scales down based on usage. But even for things like taking Microsoft Windows-based virtual applications and delivering those as a service, there's no reason why you can't cloud enable that kind of thing as well. And some of the exciting work going on with companies like Bromium and others, where you maybe don't even have to run the full VDI stack. Maybe you can just take the apps and actually make the apps deliverable as an application as a service offering, massively simplifies the amount of software that you have to run just to fire up an Outlook or a PowerPoint instance, for example. So I think there's a lot more to come in VDI in terms of ability to virtualize applications in the cloud over the next couple of years. Security and risk clearly is important. Boundary-based security and the notion of cloud clearly changing significantly. A couple of other trends there we saw in the Valley are around complete virtualization of all security capability, whether it's, and network capability actually. So things like load balancing and firewalls and all the traditional boundary-based controls are going virtual and are going essentially alongside policy management and cloud implementation, which is a big deal. So we're definitely seeing that change. The other change I'd say we're seeing is that to the point that was made earlier about the threat vector being completely different, you need a completely different kind of security vendor and security thought process, maybe back to that Einstein quote again. You need to be at a different level of thinking to deal with APT than you do with, let's say, cross-site scripting or any of the other more traditional kinds of easily detectable security risk. Social is clearly important. To me, social in our industry is important for different reasons than it is on the internet, though, and that is, we need to leverage and harness all of the thinking of the 65,000 employees that come to work at UBS every day. And the more we give them capability to share ideas around investment, the more we have things like portfolios participate in social networks and say, oh, I made 15% last week, this is how I did it, this is my asset mix, and so on and so on. The more things start to communicate in social networks, I think the more interesting the social networks will become, and the more knowledge will be created in them. It is absolutely essential to us as a financial services company to continue to grow our knowledge assets and to be able to harvest the knowledge assets. And internal social is definitely a part of how you go after that, and providing access to knowledge networks built on social so that people can find other people who have the same investment ideas or whatever, I think is very important. The reason cloud is at the bottom of the list is because cloud underpins nearly all the other things that we see on this list. And I think there's an important kind of takeaway for me on this slide anyway, which is that a lot of the implementation of cloud in the enterprise won't be controlled by the enterprise. You'll be buying cloud underneath all of the other things that you're procuring. And what that means is your control over procurement in terms of, let's say, Open Compute or any of the other standards that you want to implement can't only be about what hardware you buy, because in a target state where pretty much any software can be run on cloud, you won't be buying the hardware. Someone else is going to be doing that. So the question then becomes, how do you influence those suppliers? How do you require them to be certified such that they're pulling in the right direction as well? More on that in a second. So in terms of us and ODCA, I mean, I think the alignment is reasonably clear. I think cloud has been at the center of ODCA from the start, and as I said, it's kind of underpinning many of the changes we want to make inside the firm. Sustainability has been expressed through the carbon footprint usage model. I did a bunch of work on this in a prior life with VMware actually, and I think it's come a long way since then. So it's a great piece of work and a great asset to be able to use as well. Security and risk management has been a key area of activity within ODCA. We think there's still a lot more to do in that space, but we are very pleased to see the progress that's been made to date. And big data, I think, as an area of focus within the ODCA is important because, as I said, we're seeing a new generation of startups show up at our door with a whole bunch of capability, and it's almost like Salesforce. They're showing up with capability that they can sell directly to the business. So understanding the IT implications of that stuff is really important, and understanding how to leverage that and maybe even replace things like operational data stores, or at least make the data warehouses that sit behind them anyway more aligned to that target state is really important too. So how do we see it? What is ODCA all about for us? I mean, it's about driving data center standardization, both within the data center itself and within the content of the data center, if you like. So all of the stuff that sits inside it. We see a great opportunity to partner with many of the standards bodies on this slide and others as well, who are interested in the same goals that we have. So in terms of our goals, we're very interested in a hybrid stack with a combination of SaaS, PaaS, IaaS in various different flavors, which I'll show you in a second. And so there isn't one standards organization that we're going to be able to work with to drive that. But I love that ODCA has been almost an umbrella across these others to start to build together a story that includes all of them. So we're in the process of designing our cloud compute capabilities. We're working with a number of cloud providers to do that, and we're also doing that inside our own engineering teams as well. And cloud's ability to support technology industrialization is a fundamental building block of our business and IT strategy. So when you think about how does the business strategy of industrialization get translated into technology, well, this is how it gets translated. I mean, how do we build a supply chain for compute, storage, network, provisioning, and so on? This is technology industrialization of our existing legacy estate, and provides the building blocks then for business industrialization. So, you know, you pay for what you use as a business service, not just a technology service or a host or whatever. You know, our participation in ODCA and Open Compute are deliberate and part of the how. So you know, we do want to leverage the capabilities and the best practices that ODCA has put together, and Open Compute has from an architecture perspective around things like RFPs and RFSs and so on, and we have already done that actually as well. So I think we see a great way of adopting the best practices and getting some of the benefits that the likes of Facebook have achieved is something we clearly want to do. One other observation, honestly, from our last couple of trips to California, though, is that in order to get to where Facebook and Google and everyone else is, you pretty much have to have a vertically integrated stack. And we'll talk a bit more about what we're doing in that space, but you have to go down a path of vertically integrating your stack to get to the level of standardization that those vendors have achieved on the hardware side as well. So this is kind of, if you like, my personal mind map of cloud. You know, where possible, we want to buy SaaS because multi-tenant architectures are still the best way of achieving you know, utilization optimization, and you know, and where we get the opportunity, we're going to buy into the SaaS layer. We're also going to provide SaaS services as well to our own businesses inside the firm and outside the firm. So where we can build a SaaS platform, maybe around things like messaging or file transfer or whatever, we're going to build them with the same model in mind that we're talking about here. Platform as a service, I think, gives you a lot out of the box. So people kind of think in their own minds that scaling and elasticity are something that are provided by IaaS providers, which is to some extent true, but much of that is automated and included in the package when you buy platform as a service. So whether it's, you know, Azure or Force.com or, you know, EngineYard or any of these kind of vendors, you know, you can buy a lot more without getting into the infrastructure as a service or the hardware specification layer if you buy in at that layer. So those are interesting. We haven't done too much in that space ourselves yet, but we understand the opportunity, and we think for Azure in particular, if it's as easy as clicking a button in Visual Studio to deploy, then I think it's going to have a real pull for Microsoft developers. And we are seeing many people inside the firm ask the question, when are you guys going to support Azure inside the firewall? And second question, when are we going to be able to cloud burst? So there's no shortage of askers. Down the bottom, we think private on-prem is going to be the prevalent model in most banks, particularly Swiss banks, with some combination of private off-prem, hybrid, and public being out there. We won't use much public, I don't think. I think for projects where there is no client data involved, and maybe it's experimentation, particularly around things like mashups, it might make sense to be in a Rackspace or an Amazon or Azure. But for the most part, I think we won't be using those services as they stand today. Hybrid is interesting, particularly for things like calculation. So where you have to expand massively the calculations you need to do on a dime, like the Lehman event, for example, or something where, you know, you've got to run a week's worth of compute in a couple of hours. We see hybrid as potentially extremely useful there. And private off-prem, we're seeing more and more of the kind of packaged vendors, particularly the big data vendors, coming in with partners like Terramark or Savis or Rackspace or others. So I think that's my personal mind map of how it looks, and that's the way I think about it. So the cloud itself is all very well, But without automation, you can end up very rapidly with something that you didn't ask for, or unintended consequences. So I think policy management is extremely important, and the fact that you have the potential to revolutionize IT essentially means you have the potential to create VM sprawl or cloud sprawl or whatever. So I think you need to think very carefully about the controls at the beginning, not at the middle or the end, and decide how you want it to be managed. I love that Lockheed example because you're kind of showing there how you've built the management platform at both a personal level and at a management level, and you've integrated the whole billing and pricing piece and service level management piece actually into the platform. And that's exactly why we think cloud brokers are such an important part of the ecosystem. The ability to essentially abstract yourself away from any individual cloud, be able to leverage any VM-based cloud, for example, or EC2 or whatever, and then actually literally make it a policy-driven decision, ideally policy defined by operations. Maybe in some cases even you don't deploy until operations have made a policy decision if you're outside of your current policy framework. But we think that you want to push as many of your IT people as possible into value creation, which is generally in the software layer and aligned to the business you're in rather than technology per se. The standard stacks part of this is really important. So you can't industrialize IT unless you have a set of standard capability. So standardizing the way you build operating systems, the way you build infrastructure like your middle tier. I've put an example in this deck here of how we think about that. But bringing that together is very important for many reasons. If you think about contingency management, so you have multiple instances of the app running in multiple places, and you have to be able to prove what your recovery time is, what your recovery point is when one of the instances goes down, and that's a regulated requirement, then you have to think quite carefully about how you build that capability into your stack. Same thing with security. You can't leave that security discussion to, well, we'll figure out how to do multi-site level of assurance 3 implementations later on. That has to be a well-defined design pattern that's built into your stack. And then more importantly, from a deployment pattern perspective, is one of the things you can pick off the shelf in your cloud broker and be able to press deploy for. So we're committed to building automated delivery of services built on standard stacks with standard data and standard cloud, but we're also committed to building standard deployment patterns so that if we solve a problem once around reliability, availability, and scalability, we can reuse that design pattern anytime we want. So, a job like mine, as was mentioned earlier, is pretty hard. I mean, there's loads of competing priorities at any given point in time. We've got to balance regulation, change, complexity, market pricing, the IT marketplace and where it's driving us as well. And so, when we think about that, we have to do all of that, by the way, and reduce spending at the same time. So you've got to be agile to be able to start, stop, and scale projects with much less investment. The time to innovate, which is really an important metric to measure, has to be as low as possible, and the price to innovate has to be as low as possible as well. But you have to also have agile enough project management capability that you know how much you can take on at any given point in the cycle, and you're not overcommitting yourself as well. The implementation of policy to embed governance, control, and transparency is extremely important. There's not enough said about policy in the industry, I don't think, in general, and policy management, and even to the point of determining deployment location decisions and so on, is really important. So we've put a lot of effort into governance and policy, and in our internal thinking about how to do not only cloud, but also legacy application deployment as well. That plays a huge role for us. Standardization, obviously, we've talked about probably enough already, but reducing risk in operating environments is also important. So when you think about what risks you have today and how do you manage them, and then in let's say 2015, if you've moved this much of your estate, what risks are you going to have then? If you actually just sit down and have that discussion, you start thinking through what those risks are, then you can build a lot of the risk mitigation into the way that you build your standard stacks, your standard deployment patterns, and so on and so forth. And after, most of us living through, a number of crises, probably from '98 onwards, from long-term capital through 9/11 and through, the credit crisis. I think most of us have learned that whatever problem you've come across before, the next problem that you get won't quite be the same as the ones you've seen before. So the agility part, I think, and the ability to be able to react almost needs to be built into your design. I mentioned before that the cloud broker is really important, and this example here is showing with SDLC automation how you move from an idea to a dev cloud to a QA cloud to prod, and that all of that is actually managed through policy. So I'm not precious about which cloud broker or anything like that. I just think that the more of that you can automate, the easier it is for a developer to do the right thing. So in a way, you don't even want them to know anything about the underlying virtual hosts or anything like that they're using. It's a new Java development project. I click go. I get design pattern 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I choose the design pattern I want, and off I am to the races to go do things. And the point about IT operations and policy and control being built into the loop at every process, I believe, is one of the fundamental design points that everyone needs to consider. Especially when you think about how do you do that in 50 countries, all with IT infrastructure in them, all with different service providers, all with exchanges that we're doing business with, that we need to measure the SLAs between where our stuff is hosted and where the execution point is, and so on and so on and so on. I've kept this slide quite simple, and I've stuck it really mainly in the in the major hubs. But the reality of the situation is it isn't simple. It's quite difficult, and every country, even small countries like Monaco and places like that, still need to have backup and contingency capability inside the country, because data law has actually moved in a way completely in the opposite direction of cloud. So when you look at jurisdictional requirements around data, a lot of countries in the world require you to keep your data for the clients that you have in that country inside the walls of that country. And you think about that as a constraint, or if you like, a design input into cloud. That's an important one for people to consider when they're thinking about financial services and how financial services adopts cloud. So we think about what services can be globalized, what can be regionally hubbed, what can be nationally hubbed, and sometimes what even is hubbed at a city level. Things like options trading would be an example of that. Ten. Okay. We'll be done in 10, don't worry. Cloud service providers basically are helping, are using automation to deliver agility, and the ODCA has helped us to engage with that community. We feel like, as an individual company, our voice is this loud. As part of a broader community, our voice is much, much broader and much louder. And in particular, I think the security, regulation, automation, and transparency topics within those usage models, we felt like we've had a good amount of benefit from that. The templates from the RFPs, as I mentioned before, we've actually used already, and they've been extremely helpful. So I think that there's no doubt that for those of you who are just thinking about maybe what do you do, starting off there, when you start just looking what do you buy today, taking a look at those templates is actually really a useful thing to do. And the other thing is, I think the open collaboration model around a shared goal, shared outcome, has been extremely beneficial as well. I mean, this is one of the most open communities that I've ever seen of people who are actually working towards a set of shared goals. And in any open community, you always have disagreements, but I think for the most part, the delivery track record of this organization is something that they should be proud of as well. Okay. So, I mean, the opportunity, I think, is accelerating your own return on investment via the usage model deployment. You get the benefits of solution alignment. It massively simplifies RFP issuance. I think one trick we've learned, by the way, on RFP issuance that I'll share is don't tie other things together with RFPs for the future. So if you think about what you've got in your legacy estate, and you think about, well, I'd kind of like to cloud enable the legacy stuff as well. If that's something that you want to do, you're probably better off separating that into a separate RFP, because you're going to find completely different vendors are good at that than the ones that might be good at delivering you a proper target state cloud solution for today. We've actually found that a number of the Indian vendors the Indian outsource vendors are really good in that space, and they've set up shop basically to industrialize and almost manufacture moving your software into a standards-based environment. Doesn't mean they're good to provide the standards-based environment, but most of them now have started to partner with companies who are in the business of providing the standards-based environments as well. So I think those need to be treated as two separate topics. What's my target state platform look like, and how do I get my stuff there, I think are two separate topics in general, and it's probably better to treat them that way. Buying with confidence around open industry standard solutions is something that's been hard for a long time. Proprietary solutions have ruled for such a long time, and the interop between them has been poor. But more importantly, your software gets trapped on an island that's very hard to get off of. So when you think about in a company like ours, or any large company, how many different hardware platforms do you have? How many different OS versions do you have that maybe aren't even mainstream anymore? You still need to find developers to work on them. You still need to do maintenance releases. You still need to put regulatory requirements into those systems, and so on and so forth. So in a way, providing the scale to accelerate market adoption isn't only about the adoption of cloud, but also about the adoption of, or about the speed with which you can migrate to current software versions. As mentioned earlier, ODCA's role is accelerating cloud solutions, speaking with one voice across those 300-odd companies that we heard earlier on, is clearly sending a massive message to the market. The solution testing and the deployments based on a common foundation reduce the amount of work you have to do to adopt, so that's a big deal as well. And the sharing of that information is extremely valuable. The ultimate benefits of working together, these are industry numbers, and I think the potential of cloud probably doesn't even include the things that some of the things I mentioned earlier, where really the markets themselves are just emerging, and the questions you can ask of some of those big data as a service solutions that I mentioned earlier aren't even well formed yet, because people don't think about, if it didn't take a month for that query to return, if it took 2 seconds, what questions would I ask? So we've actually got into that situation with one of our businesses where the batch now finishes at 2:30 in the morning, and there's another 4.5 hours worth of work that we can do, and getting into, okay, so tell us what additional information would be great to have before market open, and getting into that discussion, you suddenly find actually there's a lot more benefit than just the benefit you can see. There's the benefit that you can't see as well, if you like, the part that's under the iceberg. So problem is, time changes anyway. So when we start looking at the analysis of our portfolio, let's say, versus our competitors, so there are a number of benchmarking companies out there that will tell us how agile are we relative to our competitors. What we see is that time is the greatest innovator. So over time, the people taking the biggest risks 2 years ago are now in a position which is much, much better than those who didn't take those risks. So making early bets on virtualization as an enabler for getting into cloud has turned out to be a great strategy, right? So whether it's looking at cloud storage, maybe as a more recent emergent bet to make, or whatever you decide your tech bets are, I laid out the 6 that I think are important earlier on. If you don't take the bet, then time will overtake your current operating model, your current business model, your current cost structure, and so on and so forth. So thanks for that, Francis. You had to have some English guy in there somewhere, so So for today, your forecast is unfortunately a bit stormy, actually, so don't go outside without an umbrella. But get out there. Expand your own network, meet with people who've done this before, meet with the people in the ODCA and find out what they've done to help other companies. Shape your own cloud strategy. Talk to people who've done it already and figure out how they've done it, how they did proof of concepts and deployments, where did they start in R&D and development and so on. access and assess the latest solutions, learn more about the top solution providers that meet the ODCA's requirement specification. And then finally, think about streamlining purchasing and planning. And when you think about that, think back to that picture which shows how much you can control versus how much is being controlled by other cloud providers in the industry, and start to ask different questions of the other cloud providers as well. So, with that, enjoy. Have a nice day.